Dark Side of the Ring this week was back to the kind of content that you would expect. Talking Marcus Alexander Bagwell, better known as Buff Bagwell in WCW and for about a week in WWE. We went from the wholesome scene of Haku laughing at the Shockmaster last week to this week hearing about Bagwell's mom manscaping her son's balls for him. And this is when he was a grown-ass man in the NWO. The number of times that I thought to myself, watching this, I just sat here and thought, what the fuck? Set a record for any Dark Side of the Ring episode that I have ever watched. One thing I did not know is how wealthy Bagwell's family was. He comes from a family of opulence. And according to former WCW and TNA referee Slick Johnson, who has been friends with Bagwell since he was 18 years old, Buff's father, Steve, owned a lumber company. Everybody in town got their lumber from the Bagwells. They knew the family, they knew the company. And his father was a self-made millionaire. The family had a pool, they had a tennis court, they had a movie theater in their home. And Steve bought Buff a Corvette when he was 15. When I was 15, I got to go to Disney World for the first time, so that sounds about even. And they also shared a heartwarming story about Steve, where he once lost a bet. And he got so angry that he grabbed his machine gun, because who among us doesn't keep a machine gun at home? He grabbed his machine gun, he went outside, and he unloaded an entire clip on a flock of geese in a fit of rage. Because that sounds like a perfectly rational response. That was the first what the fuck moment. The second what the fuck moment came when Steve went up to his son's room one night. He was there with his friends, they were getting ready to go out. And he asked them, where are you guys going tonight? And they told him, we're going to the club and some other places. So he pulled out 5 or 6 small bags of cocaine. And he passed them out to all of Buff's friends and to Buff and told them, have fun. Now Buff justifies this by saying that his dad was worried about them and figured, well, at least the coke was coming from someplace that he trusted. Mind you, we hadn't even gotten to the wrestling portion of this documentary yet. But wait, there's more. Because now the family finances are not what they used to be. I can't imagine why. The business is struggling, times were tough, and his parents were fighting. And Buff's father, he was beating his mom. Marcus steps in to try to save his mom, and he's got a gun in his hand. Steve runs off to go grab his own gun. I don't know if it's the machine gun, but he went off to go grab his own gun. And we got ourselves a good old-fashioned standoff in the middle of this house. Marcus fires the first shot with the intent to kill his father. And it would have, had his father not gotten his hand up to his chest just in the nick of time. Bagwell fired 4 more times on his father. And Steve says, because his father's still alive, they interviewed him for this. His father's like, I couldn't believe what was going on. Beating up on mom will have that effect on a kid, you know? If I ever saw my father lift a finger to my mother, I'd have wanted to kill him too. I actually don't fault him for that. And then a few months later, they hashed it all out, and Marcus said that the two of them have been best friends ever since. What a happy ending. They interviewed several of Bagwell's ex-wives, maybe all of them. I don't know how many times this man has been married. I lost track, but he is still friends with his ex-wives. They were practically fawning over him by the end of this episode. I don't know what kind of voodoo magic he has worked on these women, but hey, good for him. It can't be what he's packing because they interviewed Too Cold Scorpio for this, and he claimed that Bagwell has a tiny dick, which is something I didn't need to know. But if that's true, then maybe he's just a really nice guy. Maybe they like his personality. I don't know. But they still seem smitten with him. His first wife, Tanya, seems like a really nice lady. They got married. Marcus took a job as a male stripper right out of high school. You do what you got to do to make money. He doesn't regret it. He doesn't shy away from it. He says, hey, I didn't mind it. Do what you got to do. He ends up meeting Missy Hyatt, who introduces herself as the First Lady of Wrestling. And I'm sorry, that title will forever belong to Miss Elizabeth. But Missy takes credit for discovering Marcus, who had no interest in getting into wrestling. It's not like they met at a wrestling show. I think she moved in near him and she saw him one day and thought he was, gorgeous and, he'd be perfect for, professional wrestling. He didn't have any interest in wrestling. He told her, my brother wants to be a wrestler. And she said, your brother? You should try it. And he didn't think they made any money. And when she told him that their lowest paid guy was making $100,000 a year, he suddenly had a change of heart. So the deal he made with his wife is that I'm going to train and you're going to work. She worked at a club as a dancer and she hated it. But the agreement was, you support me. And once I make it, I will support you and you won't have to work anymore. I'll give you one guess as to how it worked out. Buff made it. He landed a job in WCW. He even won the tag team titles with Too Cold Scorpio. But then he cheated on his wife and she just couldn't bring herself to forgive him. So that was the end of their marriage. So much for the agreement. I know in shoot interviews in the past, Bagwell and Scorpio did not speak highly of each other. They did not get along well behind the scenes when they teamed. Too Cold was interviewed for this, though. The next what the fuck story, what is this, number 3? I think we're up to now, number 3, was Bagwell deciding that he wanted to get calf implants. He was in search of the perfect body. He didn't like his calves. His father had great calves. His mom didn't. So he thinks he got them from his mom. He got the implants, and then he started having pain in his leg. And it got so bad that his friend, Slick Johnson, had to carry Buff on his back to the bathroom and sit him down on the toilet whenever he had to do his business. And then after he wiped his own ass, Slick would come back in, pick him up on his back, and carry him out. Put him on the couch. This went on for weeks until he finally went to the hospital, and they told him his body was rejecting them, and he had to have the calves taken out or else he ran the risk of having his legs amputated. Now, any normal, sane, rational individual would hear this and go, oh my God, of course, yes, take them out, by all means. I don't want to lose my legs, which includes my calves. By all means, take them out. But no, that was not the first thought that ran through his head. This idiot had to think about it. He admits that his first thought was, get them taken out or have my legs cut off. He was trying to figure out a way where he could keep them both. You know, I'm not so sure that Steve gave them the best cocaine after all. I don't know what that stuff was laced with. This guy's not too bright. So, of course, he had them taken out. And he still has the implants sitting in a box at home. They even showed him holding them. It was footage from a television series called Vanity Insanity from 2006. They did an entire episode devoted to Bagwell. I watched all 11 minutes of it on YouTube for research purposes. And yes, that is 11 minutes of my life that I can never have back. So he eventually lands another tag team partner. This is his third. So Too Cold Scorpio was his first partner. Then it was Del Wilkes, the Patriot. They were Stars and Stripes. Now it was Scotty Riggs. And they were the American Males. And they played that damn theme song, and now I can't get it out of my head. Eric Bischoff said the same thing in the episode. It's like once you hear it, it's just stuck there for a while, and there's nothing you can do about it. So during this period, Bagwell meets his second wife, Erica. That doesn't last long. So then it's on to wife number 3, Judy, who we also heard from. So we had his mom, Judy, and his wife, Judy. So we had 2 Judy Bagwells, if you're keeping track here. From there, Bagwell went heel. He joined the NWO. Kevin Nash said to him one day, you want to join the NWO? And he was like, yeah, of course. Of course, he went to Scotty and said, sorry, Scotty, I got to do this. Poor Scotty Riggs is left in a lurch. He's like, all right, brother, if that's what you want to do, we'll make it work. And this is where the transformation into Buff took place. His first wife thought that there was still a chance that maybe they could get back together until she saw him on TV one day playing Buff, and that's when she knew there was no hope because he was basically living the gimmick. Then came what the fuck moment number 4. And there is just no topping this. Okay, so think about everything I've talked about so far. This man shot his father. This man's father gave out bags of cocaine to him and his friends. Like, I mean, again, all of this stuff, the calf implants. But this was the topper of all toppers. I hate that I even heard about this because this was my first time. Apparently, this was a well-known story to some of the boys. Not only did we get the story, we got the reenactment too. So let's set the stage first. Okay, Buff hired his mother to be his personal assistant. And they came up with the idea to set up this little corporation. It was called the Real Buff Incorporated. And actually, he hired the whole family to work for him, and he paid them a salary, and basically they would all do things to help him out, like take him to the airport. They would make sure his house was clean. They would make sure his bills were paid. All the stuff that he couldn't be bothered with, he had his family members doing for him. But his mother was the one. He was always very close to his mom. He was a mama's boy, and there's nothing wrong with being a mama's boy. Always had a very close relationship with her. Maybe a little too close. Slick Johnson tells the story of coming home one day, and he sees Mark's mom's car parked outside. He goes in, and he heads up to Mark's room, and he's got a huge bathroom in there. And in the bathroom, the door is, I guess, wide open. I think the door was open, but maybe it wasn't. But in any event, he walks in, he finds Buff on all fours in his bathtub, buck naked, and his mom is standing behind him with the skin of his dick pulled up behind his balls, and she is shaving his balls for him. Buff turns around. I want you to process that. Buff turns around and says, "Oh, hey, buddy." Buff's mom turns around and says, "Oh, hey, how you doing? Is everything okay?" Like it's nothing. Like this is a normal, everyday occurrence. Slick says, "You people are sick." And he walks out. Now, my mother isn't here anymore. But as I think back to some of the things that I have asked her for over the years, I can remember, "Mom, can you pick me up from the train? Mom, can you take me to the doctor? I'm not feeling well. Mom, can you help me out with the podcast? I'm going to start taking phone calls on my streams. I want to test out this new line and make sure it works." I can't ever remember the thought crossing my mind to ask, "Hey, Mom, do you have a few minutes to shave my balls?" And if I had, she would have told me, "You've got 2 hands, shave your own goddamn balls." From shooting his dad to hopping into the bathtub to have his mom manscape his balls, from bullets to ball sacks, the story of Marcus Alexander Bagwell. The book title writes itself. Then things take a serious turn, and they covered the neck injury that he suffered on WCW Thunder. It was April 22nd, 1998. Bagwell was only 28 years old at the time. He's in the prime of his career. He's doing the NWO thing. He was tagging with Scott Norton that night against Lex Luger and Rick Steiner. Steiner comes off the top rope for a bulldog. He missed Bagwell, or kind of like slipped past his head, and Bagwell went down with him for it anyway. Steiner hit the mat first. Buff was behind him, and his head jammed right into Steiner's back, and his neck snapped backwards. It looked sickening. At that point, he lost all feeling in his arms and legs. He thought he was paralyzed from the neck down. He laid there on that mat for almost half an hour while they tried to get the right type of stretcher out there for him. It took forever. I mean, today they would be on top of that in a matter of seconds. You go watch that segment back. They were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan had to stall on commentary and got very somber, because both of them had their own history of neck surgeries. So they knew how serious the situation was. I thought they handled it about as well as could be expected. A few hours later at the hospital, Buff could finally sit up, and he got all the feeling back in his extremities because he only bruised his spinal cord, which is where all the swelling came from. Once the swelling went down, he got all the feeling back. It's basically the same injury that Steve Austin suffered in 1997 when Owen Hart dropped him on his head. He also bruised his spinal cord and had temporary paralysis. This was scarier, though, because he was laying there for so much longer. Austin, when he had the temporary paralysis, it was for maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and then he started to crawl, and they went right to the finish. Bagwell just laid there, and he couldn't move for a long time. It's like the swelling fools your spinal cord into thinking that you're paralyzed, which just sounds terrifying. Now, he did have to get 2 plates and 8 screws in his neck, but thankfully he was able to make a full recovery, and he was back on TV within 3 months. They were wheeling him out there in his wheelchair. And there was money to be made with a Buff Bagwell comeback, like a babyface comeback run. The fans were really behind him when he came back, when he first came out there in the wheelchair, and he might have had the neck brace on, and he was thanking everybody. Like, there was real sympathy for him. They were behind him. So what did WCW do? They did a swerve, and they turned him right back heel. Now, I don't know if a Buff Bagwell babyface run would have been successful or not. The fact is, he always came across as a smug, arrogant prick. I don't know if he could have pulled it off, but the fact that they didn't even try it is just pissing money down the drain. But, then again, up against Hogan and all those top guys in the company, he probably didn't stand a chance anyway. But this is where he turns to drugs to mask the pain that he's in. And then we get to Judy Bagwell, the mother, not the wife. Judy Bagwell on WCW television. Rick Steiner loved Judy Bagwell. They were like best friends. I don't know how that happened, but it did. And Rick is the one who pitched the wild idea for Judy to become a character on the show. Buff loved the idea, and so they rolled with it, which included Judy becoming one half of the WCW World Tag Team Champions. Yes, it is part of the official record. She never worked an actual match, but Judy Bagwell was brought in to replace Rick Steiner's tag team partner, and she wore that WCW tag team title belt around her waist. Now, I actually think in a way it's kind of cool the way that Buff got to work with his mom like that. I don't think it made for great television, personally, although, she still cut a better promo than most. If you go back and watch some of her promo work, you could tell that she was enjoying her 15 minutes of fame, but she was off TV not long after that. But not forever. Forever is a very long time. Fast forward 2 years. Vince Russo has now infected WCW, and we got the return of Judy Bagwell. The return that absolutely nobody asked for. They didn't spend much time on this in the episode, and I'll try not to also, but they brought her back for the feud between Buff and Chris Kanyon. Kanyon threw her into the trunk of his car and kidnapped her one day. This all led to the infamous Judy Bagwell on a pole match where Buff had to win in order to get his mom back. And they couldn't actually find a pole to attach this woman to, so they settled for a forklift instead. So technically it was a Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. And if Kanyon won, Judy would have to be his new valet. Nothing like some human trafficking on our wrestling show. At least this was just a storyline. Little did we know what would come all these many years later. That makes about as much sense, though, as Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio deciding the custody of Dominic in a ladder match. All I remember, as far as the actual match, is David Arquette made a run-in. He got involved in some way. The less said about this, the better. One of Russo's wonderful ideas from that time period. And not the only ridiculous idea that involved Buff Bagwell. They also did a DNA match, which was basically a First Blood match. Now, why a DNA match? Because David Flair's girlfriend, on-screen girlfriend at the time, Stacy Keibler, got pregnant. And there was a sneaking suspicion that Buff might be the real father. So the object of the match was for David Flair to obtain a blood sample from Buff Bagwell that he could then rush to the back to hand off to a lab technician to confirm the paternity of Stacy's child and whether or not he was the father. 5 months later, WCW was dead. I can't imagine why. Now, another story they didn't mention, which happened around the same time as the Judy Bagwell garbage, Buff got arrested. This is a story he would rather not talk about, I'm sure, but he got arrested. At a Thunder taping, a stagehand for WCW was trying to leave the arena. He had, I guess, some carpet from the show. And Buff and a group of wrestlers were blocking the exit. And when the stagehand asked Buff to get by, Bagwell allegedly used a racial slur on him twice and then punched him. Police showed up. They were given eyewitness statements from people. They were given photos of the injury. And they arrested Buff. They arrested him for assault. Now, in shoot interviews since then, he has given his side of the story, which differs from what the stagehand said. It's everyone else's fault. Everyone but him. It's everybody else's fault. I stopped watching one of these shoot interviews. I stopped watching halfway through his explanation because it's very clear in this one interview that he was hopped up on something. Either that or he was drunk, but I couldn't take anything he was saying seriously when he wasn't slurring his words. So, yeah, not a good look for Buff. He got suspended for that for 30 days by WCW. And then came the sale of WCW to WWE. Vince McMahon picks the bones, he wins the war, and now he gets to choose who to bring over. They played the clip of Vince on TV mentioning certain names, see what kind of reaction they would get, and the reaction to Buff's name was surprisingly strong, so he made the cut. Lex Luger did not make the cut. Jeff Jarrett did not make the cut. Booker T and Diamond Dallas Page, they made the cut because they took less money to sign with WWE. They had guaranteed Turner money they could have sat home and collected, but they chose to sign with WWE. They wanted to work. And Buff Bagwell made the cut. Now, before he makes his debut, he's at a training session the day of. This is the day of his match with Booker T. And Shane Helms is one of the wrestlers in the ring working out. Now, there was some kind of an issue, I guess, maybe before this, so they didn't like each other. It sounds like there was a pre-existing issue between the two. But Shane, and this, by the way, he made some news this week when he responded to what Buff had to say here. We'll get to that in a second. But as Bagwell tells it in the episode, insults were thrown back and forth. Whoever started it, right? There are insults flying back and forth. And Helms ends up saying, well, at least I'm not a drug addict. Bagwell threatens to slap his teeth down his throat, and then he hits him with what he calls the Bagwell slap. Surprised he didn't trademark it. The Bagwell slap, he claims, is something his father taught him. It's a way to show dominance. And Shane gets knocked on his ass. He grabs what Bagwell says must have been a frozen water bottle that was sitting on the mat, and he blasts Bagwell in the back of the head with it. And now Bagwell is bleeding everywhere. But he doesn't say anything to anyone, even though he claims there's blood everywhere. It'd be pretty fucking hard to hide that, but bleeding everywhere, doesn't say anything. He goes to his own doctor. He gets 25 staples put in his head to close the wound shut. He took a black Sharpie to cover up the staples in his head that night so that nobody would notice them when he was on TV wrestling Booker T. And he went out there and he wrestled. He blames that incident, the fight with Helms, for why he got fired by WWE, because he threw the first shot, and so that's why I got fired. That's his version of events. Shane Helms has a slightly different version of events, which he made very clear on his Twitter this week. And before I get into what he said, let me read you what he told Sam Roberts about the incident. This was back on Sam's podcast in 2016. Shane said, he said something and I burned him really bad and he got all offended by it and he came and hit me in the damn ear. He's like standing on the floor and he outweighs me by 50 pounds anyway. Everybody in there knows I banged my shoulder up, so then he comes and hits me from behind and I kind of just threw a water bottle at him like this, and then I jumped out of the ring, and this was just kind of to distract him because now I'm going to go punch him in the face. But he fucking cracked his head open, and he was bleeding all over the place, and I'm like, oh fuck. I really didn't intend for it to do that, and I didn't think it would. I don't know, I guess the water in it made it harder. When I got to TV next week, the Acolytes, the APA, took my bags and put them on the WWE side. The locker room was really segregated in those days, WWE on one side, WCW on the other. Steve Austin came and pat me on the back. So that's what he said then, which honestly is not all that different from the version that Buff tells as far as the bottle being thrown and Buff gets cracked and he's bleeding. But he went on Twitter this week, after the episode aired, he tore into Bagwell, and he said, this is about the idea that he cost Buff his contract. He said, I didn't. Buff is a lying piece of shit. Always has been. There were witnesses there, and no one agrees with Buff. He used to blame Jim Ross, too. He blamed everybody except the man in the mirror. Nothing wrong with failing at something, but accountability is key. Everyone associated with that episode of Dorkside can suck ass. And when a fan noted that Bagwell seemed like a changed man after working with Diamond Dallas Page, Helms responded, he literally just went on a show and told a bunch of lies. No more second chances from me. And then another fan chimed in and said not only is Buff a lying piece of shit, he robbed his friend, the father of two, and never made it right. And then the father of two then responded and said it had to do with Buff selling his WCW tag team belts. He claims he sent the money and he kept getting the runaround from Buff and he spent months giving him the benefit of the doubt, but then reality set in that he was dumb to send him the money. He said, I should have known better, but I thought I was helping him and getting something cool in return. I still got all the proof. Just left the situation alone because I see he's clearly never going to right his wrong. He put the blame on everybody else. Dude even said that he would send other items to make up for the money I lost. and he never did that either. So this turned into a whole thing on social media once Shane posted what he did, but here's the deal with him in WWE. And there were a lot of really terrible things that happened back then as far as the treatment of the WCW guys. I mean, I can get into the Chris Kanyon stuff and the way that he got treated. And as Shane himself said, there was segregation in the locker room. You're not one of us. You got to stay on that side. And there was a separation between the two. It was like fucking high school. But what happened is they gave Bagwell a shot, okay? Even after the assault charge from the year before. And then the fight with Helms. They featured him in the main event of Monday Night Raw in Tacoma, Washington. It was against Booker T. Jim Ross and Paul Heyman, they tagged out to let Scott Hudson and Arn Anderson do commentary for the match. They brought out a WCW referee, Nick Patrick. They put WCW logos all over the screen and all over the arena. They had Shane McMahon come out. He was the leader of WCW. For one night, it basically, in that main event, became WCW Raw. And the fans took a giant dump all over it. How can you blame them? At every turn, for years, Vince McMahon convinced his fans that WCW and everybody associated with WCW, they were the enemy. And they were number 2 and we were number 1. Then they do this invasion and storyline where the WCW guys invade. And you've got Booker T out there beating up Steve Austin and beating up WWE talent. So now you're taking Booker T and you're having him wrestle Buff Bagwell, who's never appeared on WWE television ever, and who actually is a heel. All the WCW stars were made to look like geeks, including DDP. They had DDP feuding with The Undertaker's wife and doing jobs for The Undertaker's wife. And the way The Undertaker, by the way, and he's as much to blame as anybody for this, the way The Undertaker was complicit in the booking and the way they treated DDP is fucking despicable. But this match here in Tacoma, this was set up to fail before the bell even rang. You can't position WCW as the loser brand and then make a random WCW main event on a show where people paid to see WWE guys. That doesn't work. The match itself was not the worst that I've ever seen. It wasn't very good, but it wasn't like the worst match I've ever seen. But for the spot that it was put in, it failed. It failed to showcase why people should give a shit about WCW. It had one objective. Objective failed. The biggest reaction to anything in the match is when they sent Steve Austin and Kurt Angle into the ring to beat the piss out of Booker T and caused the disqualification, which meant the match was finally over. That got the biggest pop of the entire match. And then at the very end of the show, they have Austin and Angle literally throw Booker T out of the building with some help from Buff. Buff was actually helping them. And then was made to look like a complete tool because they turned on Bagwell and they threw him out of the building too. This match, let me explain to you how much of an epic failure this match was. This match was such an epic failure that Vince McMahon abandoned all plans that he had to run WCW as a separate brand. And there were plans to run WCW as its own brand. Okay, that same night in Tacoma, they had a show-long storyline with Tori Wilson trying to win herself a job by making out with Vince McMahon, only for Linda to catch him with his pants down at the end of the show. Okay, I'm sure some of you remember that. It did air. They aired on TV. And then the story was dropped. Well, what was going to happen is that in the divorce between Vince and Linda, in dividing the family assets, Linda would get control of Raw, and Shane McMahon would end up leading WCW on USA every Monday night. Vince would run WWE with SmackDown on UPN on Thursdays. Plans were far enough along with this that they had arenas booked for the WCW tapings on Mondays. I mean, they already had buildings booked. Like the brand split with Raw and SmackDown that came the following year, that's what was supposed to be WWF against WCW. Vince against Shane. That's what it was supposed to be. But then Tacoma happened. That and Kevin Dunn was in Vince's ear for weeks, trying to talk him out of this. He was trying to tell him, you can't have WCW stars beating WWF stars because WWF was the superior brand and all, and blah, blah, blah. So he played a part in it too. Tacoma was just the icing on the cake. And then the next morning, he pulled the plug on the entire thing. They did the Invasion pay-per-view a few weeks later that did a huge buy rate. I think the biggest non-WrestleMania buy rate they've ever done. And that was the end of any kind of war between the two companies. WCW was dead for good. And we got that watered-down Invasion shit that will go down as the single biggest missed opportunity creatively in the history of WWE. Now, the funny thing is, the week after Tacoma, Raw was in Atlanta, which was WCW's backyard. That was Turner Country. Had they waited a week to book that match, maybe the crowd reaction would have been a little bit more favorable. Maybe history would have been different. But the reality is, if they were going to book WCW like shit, it wasn't going to matter what city they were in. They were booked to fail from the start. Bagwell was fired a week later. He blamed it on the fight between Shane Helms. In the past, he's blamed it on Jim Ross. He blames JR for spreading this rumor about his mom calling the office and asking if Buff could get some live event date off, I think it was. JR has said that Judy had nothing to do with Buff getting fired. It was a Vince McMahon call. Vince did not see money in Buff. Buff had a higher opinion of his work than Vince did. And JR was the hatchet man who had to deliver the bad news. That was his job as the head of talent relations. And you've heard that from people over the years, and it's always a funny thing. It's like, well, this guy, JR didn't like me, this person didn't like me, Vince liked me. It's the evil Jim Ross who didn't like me. No, you dumb shit, Vince didn't like you. He just had Jim Ross do his dirty work for him. So Buff's addictions got the better of him after this. He drank, he did drugs to cope. There was an awful car wreck that he was involved in where he almost died. When he recovered, he needed to make money, so he ends up being paid $25,000 to do a show called Gigolos. And it was like a reality show, and he thought he was coming on to mentor the other guys on the show. And he claims he had no idea that it basically was softcore porn. And now he's got to go tell his poor wife. And then after that, he joined a website called Cowboys for Angels, and he became a male escort. And of course, the first woman that he meets falls in love with him, and he starts to fall in love with her. And so ends marriage number 3. Then there's another car wreck, and there's multiple DUIs. Things are spiraling out of control, and then he finds out that his mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is terrible. And she passes away. And that was a wake-up call for Marcus to get sober, or else the rest of his family was going to leave him. He was going to be all by himself. And if there's one thing that is very evident from watching this special and listening to this man throughout the episode, he does not want to be by himself. He needs to have other people around him, whether it's to do things for him or just support him in some way. So I could see where that would be a wake-up call for him, like, oh shit, if I don't get my act together, I'm not going to have anybody that I can lean on anymore. I'm not going to have anybody. Enter Diamond Dallas Page, who should be given his own wing in the Hall of Fame at this point. If anybody deserves the Warrior Award, it's DDP for all the wrestlers that he has saved. And you can find videos on the DDPY YouTube channel. They brought in Bagwell, and it was rough there for a while. He was still having issues, and DDP is trying to hammer it home, like, bro, this is what you need to do, and it looks like he got himself clean. He's got himself in a much better place now. But he says that Dark Side of the Ring called him about doing an episode on him, and Scotty Riggs was going to be part of the episode. So he decided to reach out to Scotty Riggs. He's like, well, I was going to reach out to him anyway. It's been a while. He reaches out to Scotty Riggs. Scotty, it turns out, had been living in his car for about 6 weeks because he was trying to help out his mom who was sick. And I think she may have passed away, and he lost his house. Like, he had really fallen on some very tough times. Scotty, who's interviewed for this, says he was this close to putting a gun to his chest. He was suicidal when Marcus reached out to him. And Bagwell could tell, just based on talking to him over the phone, something wasn't right. You got to come up here. You got to come up here. Come to the crib here. DDP's got me here, and I'm doing well. And we'll get you up here. It'll be good for you. And he didn't want to do it. He's like, nah, I don't think so. Like, I don't know if it's a pride thing or what. He's like, and the tires on my car, I need new tires. And, Bagwell was like, look, bro, like, you contact your local mechanic or shop or whatever. You put them in touch with me. I'll pay for them. And even Bagwell's like, for me to offer to pay for anything for anyone is like, okay, that just doesn't happen. But like, I'll pay for them myself. We'll make the arrangements. You'll have new tires, but you got to drive up here. And he wouldn't let it go. So good on him, because he stayed on top of him, and eventually, Scotty relented and Riggs drove up to where they are there in Georgia. And again, he was in a bad spot. And he looks like another man now. He looks like a new person. He was actually in the front row at Revolution for Sting's final match. And you wouldn't even be able to recognize it. It's the same person that you remember from WCW. And there's also, again, a great video up on the DDPY channel that talks about Scotty's story. They only dedicated a few minutes to the DDP stuff at the end of this episode. There's a longer video that you can watch online that goes into greater detail about where, Bagwell and Riggs were and how much better they seem to be doing now. Riggs, I think, is a far more sympathetic figure than Bagwell is. Like, if you look up his story and how they have been able to help him turn his life around, and one of the things that he was really upset about and depressed about, he had no teeth. Or the teeth he had were just in rough shape. He needed new teeth, and he was very self-conscious about that. And once DDP realized how serious he was, like he saw that he was putting the work in and doing the program and getting himself back in good shape, and he realized, okay, this dude is serious. They arranged for this clinic that has brand new teeth made up to do that for Scotty Riggs. And again, he didn't have to pay for it or anything. And they filmed all of this. And the day he gets his new teeth and everything, like, it's great. Like, it's a great story. And like I said, he comes across as a far more sympathetic figure who just happened to come into tough times because of the circumstances that were dealt to him with his family. Like I said, he ended up losing his home as a result. He was trying to take care of his mother. Bagwell was the cause of his own grief in a lot of ways. Even though he wants to blame this, that, and the other, he doesn't come across as someone who willingly takes responsibility for the problems in his own life that he's caused. He caused a lot of his own grief. Now, I hope he has genuinely turned his life around. I do. And DDP is a saint for helping him. But time will tell. At least he's still around to tell his story. But the Scotty Riggs transformation is just something that I think is worthy of more than just the 2 minutes that it got here at the end of this episode. They devoted more time in the John Tenta episode last week to the Shockmaster than they did poor Scotty Riggs here in this episode. But definitely check that video out. It's worth watching. And I'm glad he's in a much better place now.